After a mountain road crash, a young woman vanished into the unforgiving darkness of the mountains. Her brother, the most feared criminal titan on the East Coast, unleashed his entire empire to find her. First responders and his scouts confirmed she'd been thrown from the vehicle, leaving only blood and shattered glass behind. But when his men arrived at the scene, she was gone. While dozens of armed soldiers tore through highways and back roads, she lay dying in a stranger's cabin deep in the woods. The former nurse who opened her door to a dying stranger had no phone signal. No way to know that the criminal underworld was turning the region upside down searching for this woman. When they finally met, the mafia boss didn't offer thanks the way anyone expected. What happened next exposed a truth that shattered the walls all three of them had spent years building. Before we continue, make sure to subscribe to our channel and tell us where you're watching from in the comments. Now, enjoy the story. If this story touched your heart, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear that it's never too late to come home. Subscribe to our channel so you never miss another story about second chances, broken walls, and the people brave enough to knock on a stranger's door at 2 a.m. Meredith Cole had always been a light sleeper. 5 years of working the night shift in the emergency department at County General had trained her body to wake at the smallest sound, the chime of a patient call at 3 o'clock in the morning, the sharp, relentless beep of a monitor signaling a faltering heartbeat, the hurried footsteps racing down hospital corridors as another critical case was rushed through the doors. She'd grown used to rising from deep sleep in a matter of seconds, her mind completely clear, fully alert, ready for whatever waited on the other side of that sound. But here, it was different. 40 miles from the nearest town, in a cabin tucked away among the mountains and an ocean of silence, there was nothing meant to wake her. Only the wind moving through the pine trees, brushing the forest into a soft rustling that sounded like nature whispering to itself. Now and then a deer would cross her land, its hooves tapping lightly against dry leaves before vanishing into the dark. This was the kind of peace it had taken Meredith 2 years to find, the kind of peace she believed she'd earned after everything that had happened. The cabin wasn't large. One small bedroom, a living room with a stone fireplace, a kitchen just big enough to prepare simple meals for one. There was no television, no Wi-Fi. Her phone sat in a drawer, dead for 3 months, and she hadn't bothered to charge it. She didn't need to reach anyone. No one needed to reach her. That was exactly how she wanted it. So when the knock came at 2 o'clock in the morning, every one of Meredith's senses snapped awake. The first knock was soft, almost hesitant, as though whoever stood outside wasn't certain anyone was inside. Then it grew louder, more desperate. Each strike against the wood came faster, uneven, frantic, like the pounding of a panicked heart. And then, most terrifying of all, the knocking weakened, slowed, spaced farther apart, until it became nothing more than a faint scraping against the door, as if the hand that struck it no longer had the strength to lift itself again. She threw back the covers and rose from the bed with practiced urgency, a feeling 5 years in an emergency room had taught her to recognize without hesitation. Her bare feet met the cold wooden floor, but she didn't notice. She moved quickly through the dark cabin without turning on a light. Her eyes were accustomed to the shadows, and she knew every corner of this house by heart. The nurse within her had already begun calculating possibilities. A hiker lost in the forest. Someone whose car had broken down along the mountain road, walking for help. A drunk from town who'd wandered onto the narrow trail leading to her door. But that knock, the way it faded, the way it stopped so suddenly, it wasn't the knock of someone intoxicated. It wasn't the knock of someone merely asking directions. Meredith wasn't afraid. She'd seen too much inside the emergency room to be shaken by a knock in the middle of the night. She'd looked into the faces of car crash victims with bones piercing through skin. She'd held the hands of the dying while their families wept outside the curtain. She'd stood steady while blood splattered across her white coat and screams echoed through the halls. A knock at the door couldn't make her tremble, but it could make her uneasy. And now, as her hand rested on the cold brass doorknob, she was deeply uneasy. The knocking had stopped completely. Silence wrapped around the cabin, heavier than the darkness beyond it. And in Meredith's experience, silence was far more frightening than noise. Silence after a cry for help meant the one crying out had no strength left. Silence after knocking meant the hand that knocked could no longer rise. She peered through the small pane of glass in the door, but saw nothing except darkness. There were no exterior lights. No moon tonight, only clouds swallowing the sky. Just thick blackness and a stillness that felt almost funereal. Meredith drew in a slow breath. She'd left the outside world in search of peace. She'd run from responsibility, from grief, from the helpless ache of not being able to save everyone. She'd told herself she didn't owe anyone anything anymore. But someone was on the other side of that door. Someone had used the last of their strength to knock on her cabin. And no matter how far Meredith had run, no matter how many walls she'd built around her heart, she couldn't turn her back on that. She turned the handle and opened the door. The sight that met Meredith's eyes rooted her to the spot for a fraction of a second. A young woman stood swaying in the doorway, one hand gripping the wooden frame as though it were the only thing keeping her upright. Her face was covered in blood, dark and glossy beneath the dim light spilling from inside the cabin. A deep gash ran from her temple into her hairline, blood still seeping slowly, trailing down her cheek and dripping onto her shoulder. Her left arm hung at an unnatural angle that Meredith recognized instantly as the sign of a fracture or severe dislocation. Her clothes were torn in several places, shards of broken glass clinging to fabric and skin. Dirt smeared across her body, as if she'd crawled through an entire forest just to reach this door. But it was her eyes that held Meredith captive. They were wide and unfocused, fighting a desperate battle not to surrender to the dark. Meredith had seen that look before, many times, in the emergency room. It was the look of someone resisting the undertow of unconsciousness pulling them down. Someone who understood that if they closed their eyes, they might never open them again. The young woman's lips trembled, struggling to form words. Meredith could see she was trying to say something, but no sound would come, only a ragged breath and a faint whisper that forced Meredith to lean closer to catch it. And then, before any word could fully emerge, the woman's knees buckled. Meredith reacted on instinct. 5 years in the emergency department had turned these movements into reflex. She lunged forward and caught the young woman before her body struck the ground, wrapping an arm around her back and pulling her close. The woman was heavier than her slender frame suggested, the full weight of unconsciousness collapsing into Meredith's arms. She staggered a step but held her balance. Meredith dragged her inside, kicking the door shut with her foot. She lowered the woman onto the sofa, carefully positioning her head on a pillow and making sure the injured arm wasn't trapped beneath her. Then she went to work. Meredith's hands moved automatically, as though they carried their own memory after thousands of repetitions. She pressed 2 fingers to the side of the woman's neck, searching for the carotid pulse. Weak but steady. Good. She tilted the woman's head gently to check the airway, ensuring the tongue hadn't fallen back to obstruct breathing. Her respirations were stable. Good. She examined the head wound, parting blood-matted hair to assess the damage. The laceration was roughly an inch long, the bleeding slowing but the surrounding tissue severely swollen. Possible concussion. Not good, but nothing more could be done for that at the moment. The young woman let out a faint groan, her eyelids fluttering. Her lips moved again and Meredith caught a single fragile whisper. Please. Then, she slipped fully into unconsciousness, her body going limp against the sofa cushions. Meredith rose and crossed quickly to the cabinet in the corner. She opened it and retrieved her medical kit, an old habit she'd never been able to break even after 2 years away from the hospital. She kept it stocked. She checked expiration dates every month. She replaced supplies whenever she went into town, as though some part of her had always known there would come a night when she'd need it. She carried the kit back to the sofa and began. Sterile gauze, antiseptic, butterfly closures. She cleaned the head wound meticulously, removing dirt and tiny fragments of glass clinging to the torn skin. Her hands remained steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins, despite her heart beating faster than usual. This was what she'd been trained to do. This was what she did best. She drew the edges of the wound together with the closures and wrapped gauze carefully around the woman's head. Then she turned to the broken arm. She didn't have the equipment to cast it properly, but she could immobilize it for now. She found 2 flat pieces of wood in the cabin, patted them with soft cloth, and secured the arm in place with bandages. It wasn't perfect, but it would prevent further movement and damage. Finally, she pulled a blanket up to the woman's chin to keep her warm. Blood loss and shock could send body temperature into dangerous decline. Meredith sank into the chair opposite the sofa and let out a long breath. The woman before her stirred now and then but didn't wake, her chest rising and falling in the rhythm of deep unconsciousness. Meredith studied her in the glow of the oil lamp she'd lit. Even torn and stained, the young woman's clothing was expensive. Meredith could see it in the softness of the fabric, the precision of the stitching, the elegant cut. The shoes, though caked in mud, were designer. the kind Meredith had only ever seen in magazines. Her hands were carefully maintained, nails painted a pale pink, skin smooth and unscarred by hard labor. This wasn't a woman accustomed to the wilderness, not local, not someone Meredith would have encountered in the nearby town. So who was she? And why was she here, deep in the woods, at 2 o'clock in the morning, with injuries that suggested she'd barely survived something catastrophic? Meredith looked at the stranger lying on her sofa, breathing steadily, her pale face framed by clean white bandages. She didn't know whose life she'd just pulled back from the edge, and she had no idea that opening that door would draw her into a world she'd never imagined. At 24 years old, Celeste Ashford had learned how to live with silence. Not the gentle kind of silence that comes with peace, the kind people seek after a long and weary day, but the heavy kind, the kind that presses against your chest each night, the kind that makes you want to scream just to be certain you still exist. It was the kind of silence that settles in when the people who were meant to fill your life are simply no longer there. Her mother died when she was 8. A sudden heart attack. No warning signs. No chance to say goodbye. That morning her mother had been laughing while making breakfast, kissing Celeste's forehead and telling her to be good at school. By afternoon she was lying in a hospital bed, wires and machines trailing across her body, eyes closed and never opening again. Celeste remembered standing at the doorway of that hospital room, her small hand gripping her father's, not understanding why her mother wouldn't wake. She kept waiting, convinced this was only a longer sleep than usual, but her mother never woke. Her father was killed when she was 12. A gang war, they said. Celeste didn't know the details and didn't want to. She only knew that one night her father didn't come home. She sat on the staircase, eyes fixed on the front door, waiting for the familiar sound of his footsteps across the stone walkway. But the man who stepped inside wasn't her father. It was Tristan, her brother, 24 years old at the time. He came into her room the next morning with red-rimmed eyes and a face carved from stone. He sat beside her bed, took her hand, and spoke in a voice rough with grief. "I'll take care of you. I promise." And Tristan kept that promise. In his own way, he took over the empire their father left behind and turned it into something larger, something more feared. The name Ashford became something people whispered with dread. Tristan built a kingdom out of shadows, and she was guarded like a national treasure. The mansion where she lived felt more like a fortress than a home, with high walls, security cameras at every corner, and iron gates that required codes to open. Bodyguards followed her 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Anything she wanted, she only had to ask. Designer clothes, luxury cars, travel anywhere in the world. It was all hers. But the one thing she wanted most couldn't be bought. She wanted her brother. Not Ashford, the crime boss whose name was spoken in hushed fear. Not the cold man seated at the head of secret meetings with eyes that could freeze a room. She wanted Tristan. The Tristan from before. The one who taught her to ride a bicycle in the backyard, laughing when she fell and gently lifting her back up. The one who told bedtime stories, changing his voice for every character until she dissolved into giggles. The one who promised he'd always stand beside her, always protect her, always be her brother before he was anything else. That brother had disappeared long ago. Phone calls faded from weekly to monthly. Visits dwindled to whenever he had time, and he never seemed to have time. The last call had been 4 months ago. Tristan promised he'd come home for her birthday. She waited all day. She wore her prettiest dress. She rehearsed the stories she wanted to tell him. But he didn't come. There was no call to apologize. No message to explain. Nothing but the familiar silence that ached in her bones. Celeste lived alone in a 20-room mansion. She walked through vast hallways, her footsteps echoing against marble floors, and there was no one to share the sound. She could buy anything, go anywhere, yet a bodyguard always trailed behind her like a shadow. She had no real friends. The people around her were employees or security staff. They were polite, respectful, but none of them truly cared about her. They cared about keeping the mafia boss's sister safe. That was their job, not their affection. There was no one to talk to at 2 in the morning when nightmares of her parents came rushing back. No one to ask, "How are you today?" and genuinely want to hear the answer. No one to hold her while she cried. No one to laugh with her when she felt joy. No one simply to sit beside her for no reason at all. Celeste lived in a golden cage. Beautiful, lavish, suffocatingly lonely. She'd accepted that her brother loved her from a distance. With money, with bodyguards, with high walls and advanced security systems. With all the things she didn't need and never asked for, she'd accepted that this was her life, that she would forever be the sister of Ashford, the crime boss, protected yet forgotten, kept safe yet utterly alone, until a single message changed everything. That morning, Celeste's phone vibrated on the marble nightstand beside her bed. She was sitting by the window, gazing out over the vast garden without truly seeing it, her mind as empty as the silent rooms surrounding her. The vibration pulled her from her daze. She reached for the phone without much expectation. It was probably another promotional email, or a message from the housekeeper asking what she'd like for dinner. But the name on the screen made her freeze. Reed Callahan, Tristan's right hand. The only person she could contact when she needed anything from her brother, because Tristan no longer answered her calls. She opened the message, her fingers trembling slightly. "Your brother is asking about you." 6 words. Just 6 simple words. Yet after 4 months of complete silence, those 6 words felt like a beam of light piercing a sky that had been dark for far too long. Celeste stared at the screen for 20 minutes, reading and rereading each word as though they might disappear if she looked away. Her heart beat faster than it had in a year. He was asking about her. Tristan was asking about her. Maybe he missed her. Maybe he regretted missing her birthday. Maybe he'd lain awake the night before, thinking about his little sister, about promises left unkept, about a distance stretched too thin for too long. Maybe, just maybe, he was ready to let her back into his life. Not as something fragile to be guarded, but as a real sister. Celeste made her decision within an hour. She would drive to Tristan's compound in the northern mountains. She wouldn't call ahead. She wouldn't announce herself. She was afraid that if she called, he'd say he was busy, or worse, he wouldn't answer at all like so many times before. She wanted to surprise him. She wanted to see his face when he found her standing at his door. She wanted to know whether those cold gray eyes would still light up at the sight of his sister. She persuaded Patterson, her assigned bodyguard and driver. "I need space. Follow behind me." Patterson wasn't pleased. It showed plainly on his face, but he didn't argue. Celeste was still the boss's sister, and she had authority over everyone in the organization except Tristan himself. The GPS directed her toward Morrison Pass, a mountain road promising to save an hour compared to the main highway. Celeste drove as the sun dipped lower on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and violet. Her heart was full of hope, a feeling she'd nearly forgotten. She murmured to herself the things she might say when she saw Tristan. "I miss you" sounded too weak. "Why didn't you call" sounded too accusing. "You promised" sounded like a child demanding what she was owed. She tried dozens of sentences in her mind, but none of them felt right. Maybe she'd simply say, "I'm here." Simple, direct. Maybe standing in front of him would speak the words she couldn't shape. She didn't know that this decision would nearly cost her life, but it would also save her, in a way she could never have imagined. Celeste opened her eyes into darkness. A high ringing filled her ears, sharp and relentless like a church bell that refused to stop tolling, drowning out every other sound. She didn't know how long she'd been unconscious. A few seconds, a few minutes, maybe even an hour. Time lost all meaning when her head was spinning and the world around her had dissolved into nothing but darkness and pain. Warm blood streamed down her face from somewhere along her scalp, sliding across her cheek and soaking into the collar of her coat. She felt the sticky dampness against her skin, caught the metallic scent of fresh blood filling her nose. She tried to lift her left arm to touch the wound, and a broken groan escaped her throat. The pain was sharp and blinding, slicing from her shoulder down through her arm and into her fingertips. Broken or dislocated, she couldn't tell. She only knew one thing with certainty. That arm was useless now. Then the smell of gasoline hit her. Thick, unmistakable. It seeped into the car from somewhere below, perhaps from a ruptured tank or a torn fuel line after the crash. The scent cut through her haze faster than anything else could. She knew what it meant. Fuel leaking. One spark, then fire. She had to get out. Now. Celeste fumbled for the seatbelt latch with her trembling right hand. Her fingers slipped against the cold metal before finally pressing the release. The belt snapped free, and she nearly pitched forward into the steering wheel. She shoved at the door, praying it would open after the impact. It groaned in protest, but gave way. She crawled out onto the asphalt, her knees scraping against the freezing pavement, her right hand bracing her weight while her left arm hung useless at her side. She turned her head toward the rear, and her heart clenched. Patterson's vehicle lay overturned several yards away, flipped onto its roof like a beetle stranded on its back. The wheels were still spinning slowly, humming faintly in the silent night. There was no movement inside, no cry for help, only a terrible stillness. Celeste wanted to crawl toward it, to see if Patterson was alive, but she had no strength. Her body was screaming for rest, her head spinning so violently that the world tilted like a ship caught in a storm each time she tried to move. She didn't have the strength to save anyone. She wasn't even certain she could save herself. She reached into her coat pocket for her phone. Her fingers brushed something hard and cold, but when she pulled it out, her heart sank. The screen was shattered, black and lifeless, cracks spreading across it like a spider's web. There was no way to call for help, no way to reach anyone. Celeste staggered along the road, one arm cradling the other, blood still slipping steadily from the wound on her head. No cars passed, no houses lined the road, only the forest, black and endless like a towering wall, and the mountain pass stretching before her as though it had no end. She didn't know how long she walked. 10 minutes. An hour. Time drifted in a fog of pain and exhaustion. Every step was a battle against the body begging to collapse. Every breath was an act of defiance against the darkness, trying to swallow her whole. And then she saw it. A light in the distance, flickering through the trees like a fallen star caught among the branches. A cabin. Celeste gathered what little strength she had left and poured it into each step. She stumbled, fell, pushed herself back up, stumbled again. That light was the only thing pulling her forward, and when at last her hand reached the rough wooden door, she had strength left for only one final act: to knock. Tristan Ashford sat at the head of the long black oak conference table, his face as expressionless as carved stone. Around him were 6 men, each controlling a portion of the Ashford Empire that stretched across the east coast of the United States. They were regional heads, men with the power of life and death within their territories, men whose names alone made ordinary citizens tremble. But in this room, in front of Tristan, they were subordinates. At 36 years old, Tristan Ashford was the embodiment of cold authority. Tall and sharply cut, with steel-gray eyes that looked as though they had been forged and hardened. A faint scar ran along his jaw, a relic from the days when he still had to do the dirty work himself before rising to the summit of this empire. He wore a perfectly tailored black suit and an expensive watch, but there was nothing flashy about him. Tristan didn't need display. His presence alone was heavy enough to suffocate a room, enough to make hardened killers lower their eyes and measure every word before speaking. They were discussing territory, money, power. The things Tristan had spent 12 years building since his father fell in a gang war. One of the regional heads was delivering a report on Philadelphia, choosing his words carefully, as though walking a tightrope. No one wanted to misspeak in front of Tristan. No one wanted to disappoint him, because disappointing Tristan Ashford often meant disappearing without a trace. The conference room door swung open. 6 heads turned, irritation flashing at the interruption, then fading instantly when they saw who stood there. Reed Callahan, Tristan's right hand, the only man permitted to interrupt a meeting without knocking. In 5 years working side by side, Reed had never done so unless the matter was serious. But today there was something different. Reed's face was drained of color, his usually controlled eyes flickering with something that looked dangerously close to fear. Tristan noticed immediately. In 5 years, he'd never seen Reed look like that. "Sir." Reed's voice was low and rough. "It's Celeste." The room froze. 6 men stopped breathing, stopped moving, stopped existing. Everyone knew the unspoken rule within the Ashford organization. No one mentioned Celeste in front of Tristan unless asked. She was forbidden ground, the single weakness of the boss, the one thing even the most reckless men wouldn't dare touch. Tristan rose slowly, controlled. Not a muscle shifted in his face, yet his eyes changed. Colder, sharper, deadlier. "Explain." Reed swallowed, a gesture he'd never made in front of anyone. "Accident. Morrison Pass. Her car went off the road about 4 hours ago. Patterson is in the hospital, unconscious. And Celeste?" Silence, heavy as lead, pressing down on every man in the room. Reed opened his mouth, but it took several seconds before sound emerged. "She's missing, sir. Not at the scene. Not in any hospital within 50 miles. There was blood in the driver's seat. Footprints leading into the woods. Then nothing. No one dared move. The 6 regional heads sat rigid as statues, trying to shrink into invisibility. The silence stretched, the kind that comes before a storm, the kind everyone knows will end in thunder and ruin. Tristan didn't shout. He never shouted, but his silence was more terrifying than any outburst. When he spoke, his voice was low and even, like the restrained growl of a predator holding itself back before tearing into prey. Everyone out, except Reed. The 6 men stood and left quickly, not one looking back, not one daring to meet Tristan's eyes. The door closed behind them, leaving 2 men in a room strung tight as wire about to snap. "Mobilize everyone," Tristan said, his voice glacial. "Every man, every contact, every favor owed to us. Call our people in the police, the hospitals, the morgues. I want every road from Morrison Pass to the state line locked down." Reed nodded. "Yes, sir. $500,000 to whoever finds her." Tristan paused, his gaze darkening. "And anyone who's harmed her?" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Reed turned to leave, then hesitated at the door. "Sir, she was driving to see you. She didn't tell anyone, but that's where she was headed." Tristan stood motionless. No response. No visible reaction. Reed understood and left quietly. Alone in the empty conference room, Tristan walked to his desk. He looked down at the small photograph resting there, the only personal object in the cold space. In the picture, Celeste was 8 years old, grinning wide, sitting on his shoulders. Their father was still alive that day. Their mother had been gone a year, and he, 20 years old, had looked into that little girl's eyes and promised he would always protect her. He'd kept that promise. In his own way. Bodyguards around her 24 hours a day, high walls surrounding the mansion. The most advanced security money could buy. He had built a fortress around his sister. But he hadn't been there. The last call was 4 months ago. He'd promised to come for her birthday. He hadn't come, hadn't called, hadn't explained. Only silence. The same silence he'd given her for years. If she died without knowing how deeply he loved her, if the last thing between them was silence, if he never had the chance to tell her that everything he'd done, every wall he built, every distance he created, was because he was terrified of losing her. Tristan's hands clenched until his knuckles turned white. He stared out the window into the black night. Somewhere out there his sister was alone, possibly injured, possibly dying. "Find her," he said to the darkness, his voice breaking for the first time in years. "Find my sister." Meredith sat in the wooden chair beside the sofa, her eyes never leaving the stranger lying motionless beneath the thick blanket. Outside the cabin, the night was ink black, silent except for the wind moving through the pine branches and the soft crackle of firewood in the hearth. Every hour Meredith rose to check the young woman's pulse, to lay a hand against her forehead and gauge her temperature, to change the bandage on the head wound when blood seeped through the gauze. It was work she'd done thousands of times over 5 years as a nurse. Yet tonight it carried a different weight. Tonight there was no on-call physician to summon, no advanced monitors tracking vital signs. There was only her and this wounded girl, deep in the forest, far from the world. The young woman moaned in her unconsciousness, her head shifting faintly from side to side against the pillow. Her lips moved, and Meredith leaned closer to catch the whisper that slipped free. "Tristan, please, Tristan." Meredith wondered who Tristan was. A husband, a lover, but the voice didn't carry the tone of someone dreaming of romance. There was no longing in it, no passion, only desperation, need. It sounded like a child calling for someone to chase away a nightmare, like someone searching for shelter in a storm. Meredith studied her more closely in the trembling light of the oil lamp, young, perhaps in her early 20s, with smooth skin and carefully tended hands, expensive clothing despite the tears and blood, no calluses, no scars of manual labor. She was clearly someone raised in comfort, shielded from the harsher edges of life. And yet there was something in the way she curled inward, knees drawn toward her chest, arms folded around herself as if protecting what little warmth she had left. It was the posture of someone accustomed to being alone, of someone who had learned not to rely on anyone but herself. Meredith recognized that shape of solitude. She saw it in her own reflection every day for the past 2 years. As she waited for the girl to wake, Meredith rose and moved to the window. She stared into the darkness where the trees stood motionless, like towering phantoms, and memory rolled over her like a tide she could never quite hold back. She'd been orphaned at 3. A car accident, they said, though she remembered nothing. Not her parents' faces, not their voices, not the feeling of being held by someone who loved her. All she possessed were a few faded photographs and stories told by others. She grew up in foster homes, where she learned the first rule of survival. No one owes you anything. No one is obligated to love you, to care for you, to stay. If you want something, you take it yourself. And Meredith had taken everything for herself. She studied, she fought, she carved her way into nursing school without support, without encouragement. 5 years in the emergency department at County General in Chicago. She'd helped save hundreds of lives. She witnessed medical miracles, watched families weep with gratitude when someone they loved was pulled back from the edge, but she also saw hundreds slip away, saw the light fade from their eyes, held their hands in final moments when no one else was there. The system ground her down, chronic understaffing, endless overload, patients lining hallways while administrators cut budgets and raised quotas. She worked 16 hours a day, sometimes 20, and it was never enough. Never enough. There was always one more patient, one more code, one more life, hanging by a thread. And then there was that night. The night she could never erase, no matter how hard she tried. A young patient, barely past 20, rushed in critical condition. Immediate intervention required, but not enough doctors on shift, not enough staff, not enough time. Meredith did everything her training and experience allowed, everything she knew. But by the time the last physician arrived, it was too late. She watched the light leave those young eyes, felt the hand gripping hers slowly go slack, and something inside her went dark that night as well. She resigned the next morning. No explanation, no argument, no goodbyes to colleagues. She simply left, walked out of the hospital and never returned. She found this cabin as far from other people as she could manage. A place where no one needed saving. A place where she couldn't fail anyone ever again. A place to hide from the world and from herself. She'd once had someone she loved. A resident physician she met at the hospital. A man she believed understood the pressure, the sleepless nights, the quiet sacrifices. But he betrayed her with her closest friend at the moment she needed them most. When she was drowning in grief after that final shift, she learned her second lesson in life. Trust is loss. Opening your heart is giving someone permission to wound you. Yet as she looked at the stranger lying on her sofa, whispering a name in desperate sleep, Meredith felt something stir in her chest, something she'd believed had died long ago. This girl was lonely too, she realized. She was waiting for someone as well. She carried wounds no one could see, just as Meredith did. Maybe that was why Meredith didn't turn away. Maybe that was why she sat through the long night caring for a stranger as though she mattered, because for the first time in 2 years, Meredith felt necessary, useful, as though she still had a reason to remain in this world. Morning sunlight streamed through the cabin window, scattering warm golden streaks across the wooden floor as Celeste opened her eyes. For the first instant, she didn't know where she was. An unfamiliar ceiling, the strange scent of pine wood and wood smoke, the sensation of lying on a sofa instead of the soft bed she was used to in her mansion. Then memory crashed over her like a wave, and she tried to sit up. Pain dragged her back down immediately. Her left arm flared as if a blade had been driven straight into the bone, her head spinning as nausea surged up her throat. She groaned and fell back against the pillow, eyes darting around in confusion. A strange cabin. A strange woman sitting nearby, her arm immobilized with wooden splints and wrapped in cloth. What happened? Where am I? Easy. The woman's voice was calm but warm. You're safe. I'm a nurse. Well, I used to be. Celeste turned toward the voice and studied her. Late 20s, perhaps. Brown hair pulled back neatly. Dark brown eyes shadowed with the exhaustion of someone who hadn't slept all night. Where am I? Celeste asked, her voice hoarse. My cabin. About 3 miles from Morrison Pass. You knocked on my door at 2 in the morning and collapsed. The memories returned in fragments. The crash, the scream of metal, the car flipping, the thick smell of gasoline, crawling out into the dark, staggering along the endless road, a light flickering through trees, a wooden door, knocking, my phone. Celeste tried to rise again despite the pain. I need to call my brother. Meredith shook her head gently, sympathy in her eyes. There's no signal out here, and your phone was shattered in the crash. Celeste sank back, and tears began to spill. Not because of the physical pain, though her arm throbbed and her skull felt split open, but because she knew what this meant. He's going to think I'm dead. He'll tear the world apart looking for me. Meredith stood from her chair and sat beside the sofa, keeping enough distance not to crowd her, but close enough that Celeste could feel she wasn't alone. "Tell me about him. Your brother." Celeste didn't know why she spoke. Perhaps because she hadn't had anyone to talk to for so long. Perhaps because this woman had saved her life and kept vigil through the night. Perhaps because in those dark brown eyes she saw an understanding she'd never found anywhere else. "He's powerful," Celeste began, her voice trembling. "Very powerful. He controls a lot of people. But he doesn't have time for me." Meredith listened. She didn't interrupt, didn't judge. She simply listened with the patience of someone accustomed to absorbing heartbreak in an emergency room. "Our mother died when I was 8, Celeste continued, tears still falling. "Our father died when I was 12. Tristan raised me. He built walls around me, literally and figuratively. Bodyguards, security systems, rules. He said it was to protect me." She paused, swallowing hard. "But he forgot to stand inside those walls with me. I live in a 20-room house, and I'm lonely in every single one of them." Meredith said nothing, but her eyes softened, a subtle shift Celeste noticed at once. It was the look of someone who understood exactly what that meant. "So why drive alone over a dangerous mountain pass?" Meredith asked gently. Celeste inhaled shakily. "Because I got a message saying he was asking about me. For the first time in 4 months. I thought maybe he missed me." Silence stretched between them. Meredith's gaze drifted to the window and the still forest beyond. When she finally spoke, her voice was low and steady. "I understand." Celeste looked at her, surprised. "You do?" Meredith turned back, and in her dark eyes Celeste saw a pain buried deep. "I've waited for someone to come looking for me too. The difference is, I stopped believing anyone ever would. Something shifted between them then. Not friendship. Not yet. But recognition. 2 lonely women in different ways, meeting in a cabin deep in the woods. One running from the world. One feeling abandoned by it. Both carrying wounds no one else could see. "What's your brother's name?" Meredith asked. Celeste hesitated only a moment before deciding. If this woman had saved her life, had stayed awake all night watching over her, had looked at her with that quiet understanding, then she deserved the truth. Tristan Ashford. Meredith didn't recognize the name. No flicker of alarm crossed her face. Only mild curiosity. But she would learn soon enough. Very soon. Late the following afternoon, Meredith was seated beside the sofa, changing the bandage on Celeste's head wound when she heard it. The low, steady hum of engines in the distance, rolling through the stillness of the forest. Not one vehicle. Several. Meredith paused, her hands still, listening carefully. In 2 years of living in this cabin, she could count on one hand the number of times a car had driven down the dirt road leading here. Occasionally it was a forest ranger, sometimes a lost hunter, but this sound was different. Stronger. Synchronized, like a convoy moving with purpose. She rose and stepped to the window, peering out. Her heart tightened at the sight of 3 black SUVs turning onto the dirt path toward the cabin. They weren't the dusty old pickup trucks of locals. They weren't rescue vehicles with flashing lights and government seals. These were sleek, polished machines, the kind she'd only seen in films about crime syndicates or intelligence agencies. Celeste heard the engines and struggled to sit up on the sofa. The color drained from her face in an instant. "It's them." Meredith turned toward her. "Them? My brother's men," Celeste whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of relief and fear. The 3 vehicles stopped about 20 yards from the cabin, their engines cutting off almost simultaneously. Doors opened, and men stepped out. Meredith counted at least 8, all dressed in black, moving with the precision and discipline of trained soldiers. Their eyes scanned the perimeter of the cabin, assessing terrain, marking entrances and exits, searching for potential threats. This wasn't how businessmen or office workers behaved. Meredith had seen every kind of person pass through the emergency department in her 5 years. Victims of gang violence with bullet wounds and knife slashes. The men who inflicted that violence, brought in after clashes with police or rival factions. She recognized immediately the type of men standing outside her cabin now. These weren't executives. They were soldiers. Men paid to protect and, if necessary, to kill. "I should have told you," Celeste murmured behind her. "My brother isn't just a businessman." "I figured," Meredith replied, her voice far calmer than she felt. "So what is he?" Celeste didn't have time to answer. The rear door of the middle SUV opened, and a man stepped out. Tall, a perfectly tailored black suit, eyes sweeping over the cabin as though surveying a battlefield before engagement. The other men instinctively shifted aside, creating space for him as if by reflex. Meredith didn't need anyone to tell her who he was. Power radiated from him like heat rising off asphalt in midsummer. It pressed against the air itself, making everything around him seem smaller. She just didn't yet understand how vast that power truly was. The cabin door swung open, and Reed Callahan entered first, his right hand resting on the gun concealed beneath his suit jacket, ready to draw in a fraction of a second if necessary. His eyes swept the interior of the cabin in less than a heartbeat, assessing potential threats, identifying exits, marking the position of every person in the room. It was a reflex forged through thousands of dangerous encounters, etched so deeply into bone and blood that it had become instinct. Reed's gaze landed on the sofa where Celeste lay with her arms splinted and her head wrapped in bandages. For a fleeting moment, Meredith saw his shoulders lower slightly, a flash of relief crossing a face usually carved from stone. But as quickly as it appeared, the expression vanished, replaced by the same unreadable mask. Reed lifted a hand to the nearly invisible earpiece near his ear. "She's here, alive." Then he stepped aside, positioning himself against the wall near the door, clearing the way for the man behind him. Tristan Ashford crossed the threshold, and the cabin seemed to shrink. Not because he was physically enormous, though he stood taller than most men present, but because his presence filled every empty space, drawing the air from the room, rendering everything else smaller and insignificant. This was the kind of power that couldn't be bought with money or learned from books. It was power born in blood, tempered through years, lived in shadow, proven in countless confrontations with death, and walked away from victorious. Meredith watched him in silence, tall, sharply cut, steel-gray eyes hardened like forged metal, a faint scar traced along his jaw, a reminder of a violent past. Everything about him was precise, from the angles of his face to the way he held himself, from the perfectly tailored black suit to the calculated sweep of his gaze. This was a man accustomed to controlling everything and everyone around him. This was the man the underworld feared. Tristan's eyes moved across the cabin, passing over Meredith as if she didn't exist, and stopped on the sofa. On Celeste. The world stilled. In that instant, nothing else existed but the two of them. The most powerful crime boss on the East Coast, and the sister lying wounded on a stranger's sofa with a broken arm and a head injury. There was no Reed guarding the door, no Meredith standing near the window, no cabin, no forest, no world beyond, only Tristan and Celeste. Meredith had prepared herself for many possibilities when she saw the black convoy approach. She had braced for a cold, controlled crime lord who might threaten her for keeping his sister overnight without notifying anyone. She had prepared for danger, for violence, for being treated as a suspect or worse. She had not prepared for what happened next. Celeste. Tristan's voice broke on the single word, but it carried everything. The terror of the past hours, the unspeakable relief, the love he had hidden behind walls of ice. He moved quickly to the sofa, ignoring everyone and everything else. He dropped to his knees beside his sister, and his hand trembled as it touched her face. So gently it was almost not a touch at all, as though he feared she might shatter beneath too much pressure. As though he feared this was only a dream and she would disappear if he pressed too firmly. "You're alive," he said, his voice raw. "You're alive, Tristan." Celeste wept, tears slipping down her cheeks as her uninjured hand reached for his. He gathered her into his arms, careful of the injured limb, holding her as if she might vanish the moment he loosened his grip. His shoulders shook, not from cold but from emotions restrained for hours, perhaps for years, finally breaking free. Meredith stood frozen, unsure whether to remain or step outside. She watched the scene unfold with open astonishment. The man she'd assumed was a ruthless mafia boss was clutching his sister and trembling. There were no dramatic sobs, no loud tears, only reddened eyes, a voice thick with feeling, and the way he held Celeste as though she were the most precious thing in the world. This is the most feared man on the East Coast, she realized. The man whose name made hardened criminals cautious. The man who could order a death with a nod. And he was unraveling because of his sister, shaking like a child who had just found something he thought was lost forever. Then Tristan drew a deep breath. He released Celeste. He rose to his feet. And when he turned toward Meredith, his eyes had transformed. The vulnerability was gone as if it had never existed. The fear and relief replaced by the familiar chill. The crime boss had returned. Tristan rose to his full height, and every trace of vulnerability vanished as though it had never existed. A moment earlier, he had been a brother undone by the sight of his sister alive. Now he was Ashford again, the man the entire East Coast feared. His face returned to ice, controlled, impenetrable, no emotion visible behind those eyes. He turned to Reed, his voice low and even, the tone of a man issuing orders in a boardroom. Call Dr. Mercer. Tell him he has 1 hour to get here. Secure the perimeter. Make sure no one followed us. Reed nodded and stepped outside, lifting a hand to his earpiece to relay instructions to the men waiting beyond the door. Tristan then faced Meredith. His gaze moved over her from head to toe, assessing her the way he might assess an object. Quick, efficient, detached, not a physical threat, that looked decided. Simply a variable to be managed. You, he said coolly. Your name, Meredith Cole. Thank you for your cooperation, Miss Cole, Tristan replied, polite yet distant, as though addressing a server in a restaurant. We'll be taking her now. He drew his wallet from the inner pocket of his jacket with a motion so practiced it bordered on reflex. This is how he solves everything, Meredith realized. With money, with power, by offering what people want and closing the matter. What do you want? Tristan asked, pulling out a thick stack of cash. Money? Name your price. Meredith didn't move. She stood straight, shoulders back, her eyes meeting his without wavering. From the doorway she heard Reed inhale softly, a subtle sound but enough to tell her that what she was doing was rare. Few people looked Tristan Ashford in the eye and didn't lower their gaze. I don't want your money, she said calmly. Tristan paused. A flicker of surprise crossed his eyes, so brief it might have been imagined. Yet Meredith saw it. He wasn't accustomed to refusal. It had likely been a very long time since anyone denied him anything. Then what do you want? I want you to look at your sister, Meredith replied. Really look at her? Tristan frowned slightly, confusion touching his otherwise unreadable face. I don't understand what you're implying. Of course you don't. The air in the cabin thickened, sharp enough to cut. Tristan's expression hardened, his eyes turning colder, more dangerous. What are you saying? Meredith stepped forward, unflinching. If she felt fear, she concealed it well. 5 years in an emergency department had taught her how to remain steady in the most volatile moments. Facing a crime boss was not so different from facing violent patients or hysterical families at midnight. Your sister almost died last night, she said, her voice clear and firm. She dragged herself through the forest, bleeding, with a broken arm, to knock on a stranger's door. Do you know why? Tristan answered tightly. Because she was on her way to see me. I'm aware. No. Meredith shook her head, emphasizing each word. You're not. She came because she received a message saying you'd asked about her, after 4 months of silence. Do you understand what that means? Silence. Tristan did not respond. For the first time since entering the cabin, he had no immediate answer. Meredith continued, her voice unwavering. It means 6 words from your assistant were enough to make her risk her life, because that was more attention than you've given her in months. Reed stepped forward from the doorway, his hand settling on the weapon at his side. You should be careful how you speak to. Tristan lifted a hand without turning his head, signaling Reed to stop. His right hand froze mid-step, though his eyes remained locked on Meredith in warning. Tristan's gaze never left hers. Something was shifting behind those eyes, she realized. Not anger, though anger was what she had expected. Not contempt, though she had prepared herself for that. It was something else, something closer to recognition, perhaps even pain. Go on, Tristan said quietly, his voice low and dangerous. But he did not order her silence. He did not instruct Reed to remove her. He was listening. Tristan turned to Reed, his gaze sharp as a blade. What message? Reed stood motionless. For the first time since Meredith had laid eyes on him, the cold confidence of the loyal right hand wavered. He didn't answer immediately, and that silence said more than words ever could. Tristan repeated himself, his voice lower now, edged with danger. Reed. What message? Reed lowered his head, avoiding the eyes of the man he had served for 5 years. When he finally spoke, his voice was stripped of its usual control. I sent it, sir. Silence fell heavy over the cabin. No one dared breathe too loudly. No one dared shift. Meredith stood near the window, watching the scene unfold with growing astonishment. Reed continued, speaking faster, as though trying to outrun the storm he knew was coming. You were distracted. Business. Territory disputes. The Caruso situation. She hadn't heard from you in months. I went to her house last week to review security and I saw her. She looked lost. Empty. So I sent her a message. I told her you'd been asking about her. Tristan's voice dropped to a near growl. You spoke for me? Without my consent? I thought it would help, Reed said, his voice faltering. I thought you thought wrong. The 3 words were glacial, slicing through the air. Reed flinched, but said nothing further. In 5 years at Tristan Ashford's side, this might have been his first unforgivable mistake. From the sofa came a fragile voice. Wait. Every head turned toward Celeste. She was struggling to sit upright, her face pale as paper, her eyes wide with disbelief. Her voice trembled. You didn't ask about me? Tristan looked at his sister, and for the first time since Meredith had seen him, the crime lord had no answer. No control, no familiar chill, only the hollow expression of a man who didn't know what to say. Celeste stared at him as tears began to spill down her cheeks. That message wasn't from you? Silence. Tristan said nothing, and that silence was all the answer she needed. Her tears flowed harder now, not tears of joy at seeing him, not tears of relief at being alive. These were tears of disillusionment, of hope crushed beneath the weight of truth, of a heart already fragile breaking clean through. I almost died coming to see you, she said, her voice thick with grief, because I thought you finally cared enough to ask about me. Celeste, Tristan began, but she cut him off. 4 months, Tristan. Her voice rose, trembling. 4 months without a word. And I thought maybe... She didn't finish. She didn't have to. The truth lay between them like an open wound, raw and bleeding. I thought maybe you missed me. I thought maybe you wanted me back in your life. I thought maybe, just maybe, I still mattered to you. But the truth was he hadn't asked. The truth was he'd been silent for 4 months, and likely would have remained silent if the accident hadn't happened. The truth was she had nearly died for a lie, for a false hope, for love she'd never stopped carrying for a brother who had forgotten how to show it. Meredith stood by the window, watching quietly. She had witnessed many things in 5 years in an emergency room. Death, betrayal, pain too deep for language. She had held the hands of the dying, watched families fracture beside hospital beds, listened to final confessions from those who knew their time was ending. But moments like this were rare. The moment when someone realizes they've wounded the person they love most. The moment when walls built for protection reveal themselves as cages. The moment when truth, stripped bare and merciless, strikes without warning. Tristan Ashford, the most feared mafia boss on the East Coast, was standing in that moment now, and Meredith watched, not yet certain whether he deserved to be saved. Tristan drew in a slow breath, steadying himself, pulling the familiar wall of cold control back into place to conceal the turmoil twisting inside his chest. This is a family matter. It doesn't concern you, Miss Cole. Meredith didn't step back. It became my concern when your sister collapsed at my door at 2 a.m, half dead, and I'm grateful for that, Tristan replied, his voice hardening. But this conversation ends now. No, it doesn't. Reed moved forward, his hand resting on the gun at his side, his eyes fixed on Meredith in warning. Ma'am, I strongly advise you to. Meredith turned to him, her gaze unwavering. You can shoot me if you want. It won't change what I'm about to say. And it won't change the fact that she, Meredith gestured toward Celeste on the sofa, needs someone to say it. She faced Tristan again and took a step closer. You built an empire. High walls, bodyguards, security systems. You told yourself it was all to protect her. But when was the last time you actually spoke to her? Not through an assistant. Not through security. You. Directly. Tristan didn't answer. His jaw tightened, muscle ticking beneath the skin, but no words came. Meredith continued, her voice steady and unafraid. She doesn't need your money. She doesn't need your guards. She needs her brother, the one who taught her how to ride a bike, the one who told her bedtime stories. Where did he go? From the sofa, Celeste stared at Meredith, eyes wide. How do you know about? She talked in her sleep last night, Meredith said softly, glancing at the young woman. She called your name. Not Mr. Ashford. Not Sir. Just Tristan, like a little girl calling her big brother. Meredith turned back to him, her eyes cutting through the mask he was trying to hold in place. That's the voice of someone who's starving for love. Not money, not protection. Love. Tristan stood like carved stone. No movement, no protest. Only those gray eyes shifting, as if ice were cracking under pressure. I've seen this before, Meredith went on, her voice lowering. In the hospital, children with wealthy, powerful parents who gave them everything except the one thing that mattered. Some of them destroyed themselves just to be noticed. Others stopped trying altogether. She looked at Celeste, her expression filled with understanding. She hasn't stopped trying. She drove across a mountain pass at night just for the chance to see you. Then she looked back at Tristan, as though reading the quiet war inside him. The question is, will you keep giving her walls? Or will you finally give her yourself? Silence stretched through the cabin. No one dared breathe too loudly. No one dared move. Reed stood motionless by the door, his hand long since fallen away from his weapon. Celeste lay on the sofa, tears still slipping down her cheeks, waiting. Meredith remained near the window, her heart beating faster than usual, wondering if she had gone too far. Tristan stood in the center of the room, like a statue carved from stone. His face gave nothing away, the wall of cold control still intact on the surface. But Meredith saw what perhaps no one else in the room could see. Something was shifting behind those eyes, like ice cracking from within, like walls built over 12 long years beginning to crumble brick by brick. When Tristan finally spoke, his voice was different, lower, unsteady. No longer the voice of a crime lord issuing commands. It was the voice of a man standing before ghosts he had spent years outrunning. I was 18 when Dad died, he said, staring somewhere past them all, as though looking straight into memory. 18. And overnight I had to run an empire and raise a 12-year-old. I didn't know how to do both. Celeste watched him, tears still falling. But they were no longer tears of shattered hope. They were the tears of someone hearing what she had waited years to hear. I told myself that if I built the walls high enough, nothing could hurt you, Tristan continued, his voice trembling more with each word. If I had enough guards, enough money, enough power, you'd be safe. He paused, swallowing hard. When he spoke again, his voice fractured like glass. I didn't realize I was locking you in a cage. I didn't realize I was the one you needed protection from. He moved toward the sofa slowly, as though carrying an invisible weight across his shoulders. Each step looked like a battle against the persona he had constructed for over a decade. He knelt beside Celeste, not as the most feared man on the East Coast, but as a brother who had failed and was asking to be forgiven. He took her hand, his large, rough palm closing around her smaller, fragile one. I'm sorry, he said, his voice breaking. I'm sorry, Celeste. Tristan, she began, but he shook his head gently. I kept telling myself I was protecting you, but I was running from the pain of losing Mom, running from the fear of losing you. I thought if I didn't let myself feel too much, it wouldn't hurt as badly if something happened. Tears slipped down Tristan's face, the first in years, maybe the first since their mother died. Ashford, the man the East Coast feared, was crying. Not loudly, not dramatically, just silent tears that he didn't bother to hide. He wasn't hiding anymore. Celeste looked at him and, for the first time in years, she saw her brother. Not Ashford, the name whispered in fear. Not the impenetrable wall, just Tristan, a boy who had lost his mother as a teenager, a young man who had lost his father and been forced to shoulder the world at 18, a brother who had tried to protect her the only way he knew, even if that way had been wrong. She lifted her hand and touched his cheek, brushing away the tears. I don't need the walls, Tristan, she said softly but firmly. I just need you. I always only needed you. He gathered her into his arms again. This time it wasn't the embrace of relief at finding her alive. It was the embrace of a brother who finally understood what his sister needed. The embrace of someone trying to mend 12 years of distance in a single moment. He held her carefully, mindful of her injured arm, his shoulders shaking with quiet sobs he no longer tried to suppress. Reed stood by the door, stunned. In 5 years at Tristan Ashford's side, he had never seen this. Never seen the walls fall. Never seen the man beneath the legend. He didn't know what to do, so he simply stood there, silent witness to a moment he sensed would change everything. Meredith stepped back toward the window, giving them the privacy they deserved. She watched the siblings clinging to one another, watched the feared crime boss weep in his sister's arms, and felt her own eyes fill. For the first time in a very long while, she had believed she had forgotten how to cry, that part of her had died with the young patient on that final shift. But it hadn't died. It had only been sleeping. In a small cabin deep in the forest, a mafia boss was relearning how to be a brother, and the nurse standing by the window realized something too. Caring for someone else didn't make her weak. It wasn't a burden she had to run from. It reminded her that she could still feel, that her heart was still beating, that she was still alive. Dr. Mercer arrived about 40 minutes later, a silver-haired man carrying a black leather case, wearing the composed expression of someone accustomed to being summoned to unusual places at unusual hours. He didn't ask why the sister of Tristan Ashford was lying in a remote forest cabin with a broken arm and a head wound. He simply did his job, examining Celeste with quiet precision. "The arm needs a proper cast," Dr. Mercer said, once he had finished his assessment. "But there's nothing life-threatening. The head wound was handled very well. No signs of infection or serious cranial trauma." He turned to Tristan, his gaze firm. "Whoever treated her initially did an excellent job. The wound was kept clean. The arm was immobilized correctly. It may have prevented infection or worse." Tristan's eyes shifted toward Meredith, who stood quietly by the window watching the doctor work. His expression changed. It was no longer the cold appraisal of a crime lord assessing someone beneath him. It was the look of a man seeing someone clearly for the first time. After Dr. Mercer finished setting Celeste's cast and administering pain medication, Tristan moved to stand beside Meredith at the window. He kept a respectful distance. Not close enough to intimidate, but near enough for private conversation. Silence stretched between them. Outside, the sun was sinking, staining the sky in hues of orange and violet. Inside the cabin, Dr. Mercer packed his instruments. Reed kept watch at the door, and Celeste rested on the sofa, with her arm newly secured in plaster. "I don't know how to thank you," Tristan said at last, his voice low and steady. "You don't need to thank me," Meredith replied, her gaze still fixed beyond the glass. "You need to change." "I know." She turned to look at him, her eyes sharp and searching. "Do you? Or will you return to your empire tomorrow and forget everything that happened here?" Tristan was quiet for a moment, weighing his answer. He could have lied. He could have offered promises she might have wanted to hear. But after everything that had unfolded, he found he didn't want to lie. Not to her. "I don't know," he admitted. "I've been this way for too long. I'm not sure I know how to be anything else." Meredith studied him, and something in her expression softened. "That's the most honest thing you've said all day." The corner of his mouth lifted slightly, almost a smile. "How did you know what needed to be said?" Meredith fell silent for a moment, watching the forest sink deeper into dusk. When she answered, her voice was gentler, as though sharing something she rarely allowed anyone to see. "Because I'm running too. Different reasons. Same walls." Tristan looked at her differently then. Not as a subordinate, not as a risk to be calculated. He looked at her as an equal, someone who might understand his battles because she carried her own. "You're not just a nurse, are you?" he asked quietly. "I was," Meredith replied. "Maybe I still am. I haven't figured that out yet. Why did you stop?" She didn't answer immediately. Her eyes drifted back to the fading light, and the memory returned. The young patient, the light leaving his eyes, the helplessness of not being able to do more. The sound of the flat line echoing like a funeral bell inside her mind. "Because I cared too much," she said at last, her voice rough at the edges. "And the system didn't care enough. Something broke." Tristan nodded slowly, his gaze distant, as if staring into the ruins of his own past. "I understand what it means to break." For the first time, two strangers from entirely different worlds looked at each other and saw something shared. Not status, not power, not the distance between a mafia boss and a nurse who walked away from her calling. They saw the walls they had built around themselves, and the suffocating loneliness inside those walls. They were both running, in their own ways, both trying to protect themselves from pain, even if the price was isolation. The convoy was ready outside the cabin. Celeste had been carefully settled into the middle SUV, her newly cast arm supported with soft pillows. Dr. Mercer seated beside her to monitor her condition during the drive. Reed had stepped out ahead of them, coordinating with the others to secure the route back. Tristan paused at the cabin door, one hand resting against the wooden frame. He turned to look at Meredith, who stood in the middle of the living room with her arms folded across her chest. "I have a proposition," he said, his tone calm but serious. "Come work for me, as Celeste's private caregiver." Meredith lifted an eyebrow, unable to hide her surprise. "I already told you. I left nursing." "And I told you," Tristan replied evenly. "Last night proved you didn't leave. You're just resting." "Resting for 2 years? I've seen people rest longer than that," he said, studying her with sharp eyes no longer edged in frost. "The question is whether you're ready to stop running." Meredith fell silent, unsure how to answer. This was not something she had anticipated. When she opened the door the night before, she had prepared herself for danger, for trouble, for being dragged into matters far beyond her quiet life. She had not prepared for a job offer from the most powerful crime boss on the East Coast. "Why me?" she asked. "You could hire anyone." "I could," Tristan acknowledged, "but anyone else would be too afraid of me to tell me when I'm behaving like a fool. Apparently my own men have that problem." His gaze flicked briefly toward Reed outside, a faint trace of irony in his eyes. Then his voice softened. "Celeste needs someone who sees her, not the boss's sister, not something to be guarded. Her. You did that in one night better than anyone has in years." Meredith said nothing. She simply looked at him, weighing his words. "I'm not asking for an answer now," Tristan continued, reaching into his jacket and removing a small business card. "Think about it." He handed it to her. Meredith glanced down. Only a single phone number. No name, no logo, no address. Simple and enigmatic, like the man offering it. "When you're ready," Tristan said, then turned and stepped outside. Meredith stood and watched the convoy depart. The 3 black SUVs turning one by one onto the dirt road. Dust rose in the fading sunlight and slowly dissolved into the air. The hum of engines grew fainter and fainter until the familiar silence of the forest returned. She remained outside the cabin, alone, as she had been for 2 years. The wind moved through the pine branches with the same soft rustle she had heard 1,000 times before. Everything appeared unchanged. The cabin still stood. The forest still surrounded her. Solitude remained her only companion. And yet something was different. For the first time, being alone no longer felt like peace. It no longer felt like the refuge she had sought. It felt hollow, like a room emptied after all the guests have gone. She looked down at the card in her hand, her fingers tracing the raised numbers. A choice. For the first time in a very long while, she had a choice that wasn't about running away. 3 months later, Tristan Ashford was still the most powerful crime boss on the East Coast. His name still traveled in whispers edged with fear. His empire still stretched from Boston to Miami, controlling what needed to be controlled, protecting what needed to be protected. But something had shifted. Those who worked closely with him could sense it, even if none of them would ever dare speak it aloud. He shortened meetings. Long hours once spent dissecting territory and profit were now concise, direct, stripped of excess. He delegated more to Reed, trusting his right hand with matters he once insisted on overseeing, personally. And every week, no matter how crowded his schedule, no matter what crisis demanded his attention, he reserved one evening for Celeste. They sat at the dining table inside the mansion that had once echoed with emptiness across its 20 silent rooms. Now laughter lived within those walls, not forced laughter, not polite conversation, but the real sound of a brother and sister finding one another again after years of distance. They spoke of everything and nothing. Not reports, not security briefings. Tristan asked Celeste what she had done that day and truly listened to her answer. She told him about the book she was reading, the film she wanted to see, the small, ordinary things she had once carried alone with no one to share them with. The walls were still there, but now they had windows, and sometimes doors. Meanwhile, Celeste and Meredith wrote letters to one another. Meredith didn't have a phone, but she maintained a post office box in the nearest town, about 40 minutes from the cabin. Every 2 weeks she drove into town to collect her mail, and there was always an envelope waiting in Celeste's elegant handwriting. Celeste wrote about her new life, about a brother who was trying, about evenings that were no longer silent inside a 20-room house, about what it felt like to be heard, to be seen, to be loved in the way she had longed for all those years. Meredith replied with shorter letters, asking about Celeste's health, describing the deer that wandered past the cabin, the autumn air turning crisp, the leaves shifting into gold and crimson. An unlikely friendship took root between them, the sister of a powerful crime empire and a nurse living in quiet exile in the woods. Two women from different worlds, bound by one night and by the loneliness they both understood too well. The most recent letter arrived on an autumn afternoon, when the trees had fully surrendered to shades of amber and red. Meredith sat by the cabin window in the slanting light and read each line slowly. "You were the first person to tell my brother the truth. Thank you for giving him back to me. P.S. He asks about you sometimes. I think he respects you. That's rare." Meredith lowered the letter and looked around the cabin. Everything appeared the same. Still quiet, still safe, still 40 miles from the rest of the world. But something had changed. Or perhaps she had. The business card still rested on the table exactly where she had placed it 3 months earlier. She had looked at it every day, thinking about the offer, about the choice it represented. She had come to this cabin to run. From the job that had broken her, from the failure she carried after losing a patient, from a pain she believed would never heal. But that night, when the knock came at 2 a.m, when she opened the door to find a young woman dying, she hadn't run. She had stayed. She had fought. She had cared. And it had changed everything. Meredith rose, crossed to the table, and picked up the card. She studied the embossed number against the white surface, feeling its slight weight between her fingers. Then she stepped outside the cabin and closed the door behind her. For the first time in 2 years, Meredith Cole walked toward the world instead of away from it. The Ashford mansion came into view as the black car rolled to a stop at the main gate. Meredith stepped out and lifted her eyes to the grand structure Celeste had described so often in her letters. Yet it didn't feel cold the way she had imagined. Warm light glowed from the windows, and more than that, laughter drifted out from inside. The front door flew open, and Celeste ran toward her, hair lifting in the autumn breeze, joy shining across her face. "You really came. You actually came." The two women embraced, and Meredith smiled. For the first time in a very long while, her smile carried no loneliness. Tristan appeared in the doorway, hands resting in his pockets, observing the scene before him. He still carried power in his posture, still bore the quiet danger of the crime lord the entire East Coast respected and feared. But his eyes were different now. Warmer, softer, more human. "Welcome," he said with a nod. "You owe me a detailed job description," Meredith replied, a note of humor in her voice. "Come inside," Tristan said, something close to a smile touching his lips. "We have a lot to discuss." 3 people, 3 walls, 3 prisons they had built for themselves. Celeste, the young woman in a gilded cage, protected from everything except the loneliness that slowly hollowed her from within. Tristan, the empire builder who believed he could shield the person he loved most with power and money, forgetting that his presence was what she needed all along. And Meredith, the nurse who fled from the world, afraid that caring too deeply would destroy her, afraid she could not survive another failure. But one night changed everything. A crash on a mountain pass. A fragile knock at 2 a.m, faint and desperate. A stranger brave enough to open the door instead of pretending she had not heard it. Sometimes the walls we build to protect ourselves are the very things that imprison us. Sometimes the person we save becomes the one who saves us. And sometimes all it takes is one brave soul willing to speak the truth no one else dares to say. The mansion doors closed behind them. Not to shut out the world, not to raise another wall, but to begin a new chapter where walls have windows that let in light, and no one has to be alone anymore. Sometimes a knock on a stranger's door at 2 a.m. isn't the end. It's the beginning. This story reminds us that loneliness isn't destiny, that the walls we build can be torn down if we're brave enough, that it's never too late to change, to heal, to return to the people we love. If this story touched your heart, please press the like button and share it with someone who needs to hear that it's never too late to come home. Subscribe to our channel so you don't miss more stories about second chances, broken walls, and the people brave enough to knock on a stranger's door at 2 a.m. How did this story make you feel? Have you ever built walls around yourself? Has anyone ever been brave enough to tell you the truth you needed to hear? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We would truly love to hear what's in your heart. Thank you for watching today. We wish you good health, a joyful life, and peace in each new day. Goodbye, and we'll see you in the next video.